Trump where government shouts fake news at every criticism. In the age of surveillance, where your citizens are rendered defenseless against the prying eyes of the state. And in the age of rising military juntas, corrupt governments, and scandals such as the recent Panama Gate, we think independent state is the ultimate defense that we have against indoctrination by the state. Because understand this, media is a very, very important tool. The way that this tool is used depends on whose hands it is in. And we think that a government whose sole purpose is to get re-elected is a very dangerous hand to put it in. Which is why we at Side Proposition are proud to propose this motion. But let's define to you this motion, right? What do we mean? When we talk to you about a democratic state, it's self-explanatory, but basically a government that's elected in by a majority vote. When we talk to you about ownership over media organizations, we think that government shouldn't have full or partial ownership. It can't buy shares in these channels, and more importantly, there can be no funding. So these media organizations are basically newspapers or magazines or, for instance, television channels as well. We think our burden in this debate is simply to prove to you that basically the state owning media goes against the principles of democracy. And if we prove that to you, we win this debate. But let's move on to the three lines of argument that we have for you. Number one, how on a principle level, the state should not have the ability to manipulate voters. Secondly, the harms that this has on the democratic process. And three, which is our second speaker case, how state-run media undermines journalistic integrity. So let's move on to this first argument first. And this argument is very, very important. Because understand that we as Side Proposition believe that taxpayer resources cannot be used by the state to manipulate the vote, whether or not they succeed in doing so. Just giving them the ability is principally wrong. Why is this so? Because we believe in the principle of having free and fair elections, and there's multiple examples of this in the status quo as well. For instance, state funds cannot be used to fund election campaigns. For instance, you have an interim government before elections because you make sure that the previous government does not use state apparatuses to influence the next elections. The purpose of these examples is to prove to you that in this case, the state has to ensure absolute neutrality, which does not come about through media. We think that governments will always have this vested interest of being elected again. That very interest is one big reason for why we can't give media into the hands of these governments, right? Because we think it goes against or contradicts the principles of democracy because you're using taxpayer money in order to do so. And that we think is principally apart. So on a very deontological level, regardless of whether they actually end up manipulating voters, the fact that you give them this ability, we think, is wrong and goes against the principles of democracy. But let's then prove to you within our second line of argument where this manipulation actually takes place and is actually very, very dangerous. But before that, go ahead, madam.
Do you oppose state-mandated curricula in public schools?
Sit down, madam. Yes, we do. Okay, let's move on to our second line of argument. Let's talk to you about the importance of media in the democratic process, right? Understand that the media is basically the only source of information that we as people have. So we rely on TV channels, we rely on news agencies to inform ourselves, and this information is what we then use to hold the government accountable, the information that we then use to vote in another government. So the importance of media is very, very, very crucial to the process. Having proven this to you, let's explain to you how this purpose is then manipulated by states in two scenarios. First, where there are counter-narratives in the form of private corporations, and secondly, where there aren't. So first scenario, where there are counter-narratives, which is their best-case scenario, so we'll disprove this here. So even if these other counter-narratives exist, even if you have other channels, what is the problem? The problem is that there's preferential treatment given to government's own channels. They don't tend to not fund or rely on private channels because they expect that they can turn against them any time, or that they're not entirely loyal to the state, which is why they focus on their own channel. Why is this harmful? Ma'am, sit down, madam. This is harmful because the state then controls the way information goes out. So for instance, interviews that bring in people from parliament or leaders are taking place within these news channels, where the government controls the way the interview takes place. Your people watch that, are influenced by that, because that's what happens. Secondly, the access even to government, right? So for instance, allowing journalists into parliament, giving them the resources that they need to make news stories. We think these are the ways in which governments influence the way that their media houses represent information, right? But thirdly, Frank, we think that some things like heavy taxation on other corporations takes place, on other news channels, to make sure that they're not that efficient. What is the motive of doing all of this? The motive of doing all of this is to ensure that people focus on their channel. Why does this happen, right? We've seen the example of Bangladesh, when in 2014, when there were mass protests, there was a media blackout, and the only channel which was open was the government's own channel. That proves to you that the motives of the state are very dangerous when it comes to the media. But lastly, right, we think as far as access to news stories goes, so because the government itself is aware of things as they take place, right, the government knows everything first, which is why it takes this information and gives them to their channels first. So the first source of information in this case is this news channel that is owned by the state. Why is that harmful? Because people then rely on this channel to give them the first source of information. The first opinion that they build on any story comes from this news channel, which we think is very harmful because that is the opinion that stays in most circumstances, right? So we think that this guarantees that state gives you biased information, this information sticks, and other channels cannot counter it. But secondly, right, let's talk to you about our best case scenario, which is how there are no other counters, right? We have examples of where you have only state-run media. The problem here is that you end up forming an echo chamber. Why does this happen? Because you paint rosy pictures of government activities, right? You carry out war propaganda, make your faults, you hide your errors, and present your good side. That's harmful because there are no other channels to counter that influence. The only source of information people have is this one channel. So the minimal benefit that you may have gotten in their world with counter narratives doesn't even exist in our world. So how does this harm then democracy then, right? We have the example of Singapore, where you have largely state-run media, and you have the same government in power for the past 60 years. They can't prove to us that there's no link between the two, because if media is your only source of information, and that information is what leads you to vote, if media is influenced by this one government, then we think the likelihood of this one government staying in power is very high. And that harms democracy, because then it's not really democracy, right? So then let's prove to you the harms in two ways, right? Firstly, the political harms. The political harms I've talked to you about before is that it harms accountability, generally bad for democracy, harms the vote, also bad for democracy, right? But secondly, let's talk to you about the social harms of this, and the way that this influences social attitudes, right? So the way that we watch the media, and the way the media portrays a certain group of people or certain scenarios to end up influencing the way that we act in social situations, right? What are examples of this? And understand this argument is very important for weak democracies or third world countries. So for instance, with Myanmar, we think the state carries out this narrative that the Rohingya Muslims are bad people and deserve whatever they're getting. That's very harmful. Or for governments that like going to war can very easily convince their people that this war is justified. This is harmful for social causes because your people then do not hold the government accountable in this way as well. Firstly. Secondly, in countries like Pakistan, where Ahmadis are a minority, people that aren't considered Muslims under the state are people that are the kind of people that are targeted by your average man because your government carries out this narrative that these people deserve what they get. So we think in terms of influence and attitudes, you do the same thing. So because we're the side that supports democracy in its purest form, and we're the side that ensures it, please vote Pakistan.
In the dream world of the structures of society that we're being taught in elementary school, media is supposed to be unbiased and neutral. Sadly, that is not the case. Private corporations are turning news into reality shows, into digestible entertainment. We need the state to provide you with unbiased, neutral information. We support democratized news, not politicized news. Very proud to be on team opposition. What am I going to do in my speech? First off, I'm going to be providing you with our stance. Secondly, talk about what we heard from the first proposition speaker, and then provide you with the first 2 parts of material. First on how we actually enforce the rules of democracy. Secondly, how we have the incentives of the state and how we have better news because of that. Lastly, Marius will talk to you about diversity of news on our side. First off, what do we stand for on team opposition? We believe that democratic nations should run or own a media organization. We believe they should pursue try to aim to provide the most neutral and unbiased news. We believe they're the best actor to do this, right? We think states are already put in place in which they keep itself accountable. We think the state is divided into branches, and they are already showing that they can do this. Secondly, let's just ask, what do we think this looks like? We think the context that is important to understand this debate is that huge companies are owning a variety of media organizations themselves. That is in the sense that you have the Koch brothers owning Fox News and Breitbart, right? These media provide partisan news, and we think we need to counter that with the media organizations provided by the state. These are subsidized by the state, but they are run by independent journalists, right? These journalists don't work cheek to cheek with politicians. They have have to go and have a code of conduct, and we think that these are oftentimes designed in a way where you have sub-branches where you can complain as a citizen if you feel that your media is being biased. But also, we don't support a monopoly in news. We think we can have the coexistence of both the state-owned organizations and the private ones that they're talking about on their side. What did we hear from the first proposition speaker? Basically, the claim that they give throughout the whole speech is that this mischaracterization of what a politician is. That basically, BBC has the intent of brainwashing all of its citizens because it's owned by the state. We think what they identify is that politicians are motivated by getting re-elected. Why was that not a bad thing? That is a good thing, right? Because that means that you are always held accountable. Every single step you take is held accountable in the news. That is why we think that these people are able to provide you with neutral and non-partisan news. We think that we counter that when you counter that with the independent, profit-oriented media markets that exist on their side that focus on sensation, right? We can have the coexistence of both of them. Then we ask them in a PY, do you support state-imposed curricula? Here they say, no, they wouldn't do that. At that point, we think they concede to how the state is able to provide the most neutral and best curricula for all children. But also, we don't know how will curricula be substituted on their side then? Would you have independent private organizations providing this? We think the state is the only one who has the unique responsibility of providing this on our side. Let's move into our first point of material about how we have a better democracy that clashes with the majority of what they talked to you in the first speech. First off, let's talk about state responsibility. We think that the state has the responsibility of easing the path for every citizen to get out and vote to the greatest extent. It is not enough for a state to say you have a vote. The state needs to ensure that you are able to spend that vote in a way which it translates into you actually being helped. This is why states provide transportation for you to get to a poll if you live far away, but it's also why you go to school as a student, right? Because you're educated to understand the problems of society. That leads us to the conclusion that information is a cornerstone of a functioning democracy. That is why we need to have the state providing the access, right? On their side, there are people who simply do not have access to information to the same degree. We think that the state has that opportunity. But we think that's because we're informed on the basic political picture of the nation, what your party stands for, what will your vote actually translate into. That is crucial information that some people won't have access to. Why do we think that neutrality is important for this to happen? This is because humans are pretty receptive to emotional narratives, to appeal in other ways. We think that it is important for you to have access to somewhat boring information-based news, right? Because that is the way you are able to access these results best and not lose your independence saying what you actually believe. That is why we think that states have that obligation to provide this access. On their side, we think that not every citizen has that access, right? Furthermore, every citizen is forced to conform with a certain biased news station, right? You don't have any access to something that's state provided and as interested in providing for every single one in society, right? We think that is when you are first. That is when you don't have the ability to see things in the best and clearest perspectives. In order to have the best democracy, people need to know the neutrality of something, right? We think that there are topics that are really difficult to portray in neutral ways, right? For example, healthcare, for example, wars. In their world, every single media will go out and say, oh, this is terrible, or oh, this is really, really good, we should fight for this. But on our side, the state is able to just provide you with the bare information of that in the most neutral and good way because they're held accountable by the citizens. Before moving into my second point about state incentives, I will take the floor and some guests.
Point, madam, the question we're trying to ask you within this debate is, would you then also, by your own logic, would you allow politicians to use state funds to, for example, run their election campaigns?
We think that's what extent already happens. We think a lot of politicians already use taxes to run their campaigns. We don't think that's a problem. We don't really know where they're going with that point. Let's move into a second point about state incentives. So first off, let's just make a comparison between how states are, with the motives of states and the motives of private competitions, and why we think it is essential to have that role in the world. So first off, what are states motivated by? As a state, the majority of news covers every single action that you have, right? Every single step you take that is wrong loses you a vote. That means you're interested in doing things right, in doing things in a neutral way to the extent that people think that you are not being unfair. We think that is because you are let's ask, what is the interest of the voters, right? These are in the end the ones who hold you accountable. A voter wants you to portray something in a neutral way. That is why NPR is constantly under criticism of being too democratic, of being too left-wing. That citizens always criticize state able to still provide this. States are fundamentally under a system of checks and balances that do not exist for markets. Now, what are the incentives of companies and the motives of them, right? Think. A company relies on funding, but like that means you're allowed to say basically whatever you want, insofar as you have your money from ads, you have your money from like citizens. You don't have the burden that states have, right? So, moreover, we think a lot of news organizations are owned by companies to the extent that you can like watch a video of a range of different news organizations owned by the same company, and they will tell you the exact same thing in every single like news story because they're controlled by this one thing that is profit-oriented. What do you think the impacts of this is that we provide you with on our side? First off, we have more neutral news, right? This is really important because it's difficult for like citizens to access this otherwise. Companies really don't have this duty. Like companies are oftentimes pretty explicit about their biases, pretty explicit about what they want you to believe. We provide you with that on our side. Secondly, we think because state media is funded upon a stable level of investment, state media organizations are able to cover things that are costly, even at the expense like of other money on a budget, right? Because you always have the stable investment, you don't have to constantly fight for this. But moreover, we think you have less specialization. Profit-oriented markets are always going to want to cater to your emotions. They're not interested in you knowing what actually happens within a society. That's why you have breaking news about celebrity divorces, breaking news about pollen allergies, random things that aren't essential to you as citizens. We have democratized news, not politicized news. Proud to be a team opposition.
In a debate like this, it isn't always opposition's burden to prove that they should be only private companies. We concede to that. But in this particular case, where the first speaker gives reasons for why private corporations are always worse off than the state, when it comes to dispensing news, they need to then create a distinction and show why they're not okay with the monopoly. Because they simply stated that without giving any reason for why these private corporations should even exist within the first place, if the kind of news they give is so partisan, if it's so harmful, if they think that state is always in a better position, they're very inconsistent within their own stance, and they concede that there's some value to private corporations, the value that we're propagating at proposition. But now that we've placed this burden upon them, let's understand what we clearly define as our burden, which was a very principled deontological burden within this debate, that hey, it falls within the principles of democracy for a state to not run media, that it's contradictory to the purpose of democracy. And that's the first clash within this debate, right? And over here, they don't really respond to this idea, because it's not about whether this media is unbiased or whether this kind of media is biased. It's that it could be biased, and that potential itself, giving that ability to the government, is harmful. We think they never engage on this level, and they need to refute the best part of our case, not just what's easy for them to refute. No, thank you. And here's where our idea comes in regarding how politicians, for example, can't take out money from the state budget to fund their own political campaigns. For example, Obama couldn't use taxpayer money in his re-election campaign because that was something that he had to fund himself. Over here, that's exactly what we're trying to show to you, right? What we're trying to state over here is that politicians should not be able to influence the results of the next election with the state apparatus they currently have. And if somewhere that does happen, we're very principally against it. That's why we encourage things like interim governments in many states around the world, because we want a degree of neutrality before the next election. We told you that the potential this has to harming the democratic principles is enough to win us a debate. They don't refute this, but they bring their own counter idea within their positive case about how well it has a duty of the state to provide information, and they does so, for example, with trains and postal stations and all of that. There's a clear distinction, because those things like trains cost a lot of money and people need to purchase tickets and things like that for it. But when it comes to media, there's no direct need. It's people are already being informed, right? So the fact of the matter is, whether it's like a state-run channel like the Pakistan Television Network or the PTV, or whether it's something, no thank you sir, or whether it's, for example, another network like CNN or Fox, they know the consumer has to pay for them, so we don't see why the state has a duty in essence to give it when there's no actual need. But on a second level, let's move on to the issue of whether the state media really is unbiased or not. Because over here, they've made interesting characterizations that state media is boring. They're trying to make this debate a debate over sensationalism versus factual news. It's not that debate whatsoever. We think both we think that it's not like the state itself just gives facts and figures, or every day they're like, here are 10 pros, we're going to 10 pros and cons of war, we're going to repeat them in a boring way, we're not going to show you any graphic images. We think even the words you use within media, the kind of imagery you portray, and the words you use in combination with it is itself creates this implicit kind of bias, where we've clearly shown to you that there's an explicit bias within news because of the fact that they want to show that the things aren't as bad as other news organizations are painting them out to be. They have an incentive to do this every time, because if people believe that the state right now is failing, they're unlikely to re-elect that state. And here's where they don't really refute this idea of a re-election incentive properly. They just keep going in circles and make a parallel case, where they're like, well, you know, these individuals will hold the state accountable. Well, how do you hold something accountable when you know that there's a problem, right? How do you know there's a problem? You get information. If you're not getting that information because your overwhelming media narrative is controlled by the state, we think you never know that there's anything wrong within the state. That's what a problem for a lot of viewers of PTV who think that the state is doing just fine and that our country is not in shambles. No, thank you. But apart from that, when they themselves give examples of the National Public Radio, now it's criticized for being far left, that itself shows that state-run apparatus and media is actually biased in one way or another, and the fact that people criticize it doesn't stop it from being biased, it's still biased within the status quo.
Sir.
But apart from that, private organizations are also centrist, right? Like the MNSBC, like the MNBC, right? There's lots of organizations which don't really take a political stance or actually focus on the center. But apart from that, never once did they refute our argument regarding social attitudes. So they either need to come up here and tell us that minorities don't matter, like Rohingya Muslims or the Ahmadi community within Pakistan, which are constantly persecuted because the state runs its own idea and it tells people that these are bad individuals and you should do everything you can to curtail their rights, which leads to things like hate crimes against them. They need to tell us why the state is okay in propagating or believe something it does do. Yes, madam.
As businesses, private news sources have to either use sensationalism to attract viewers or raise their prices. How can your site ensure both quality and access?
Why do you assume sensationalism is something that's bad? It's something we're still trying to make this debate about. You need to actually qualify that for us. We believe that a lot of people actually cater to the center and don't want to go towards different political extremes. That's an entire market that they really want to tap into. With that being said, now that I've shown to you that they're not fulfilling their burden, that we are better fulfilling our principal burden, and on top of that showing to you political and practical harms like how the Singaporean government still remains after 60 years and there's no change in that government, we've clearly shown to you that we're winning this debate. Let me give you one more reason. I've talked to you about how state media undermines journalistic integrity. We think that when it comes to journalism, there's a certain amount of integrity you hold to the idea that journalists should be allowed to freely explore various ideas that they want to research on, right? And that their ability to freely produce and publish those articles. Now, we want to make a clarification over here. We understand that yes, there's like, for example, on the far left or the far right, news organizations might to some extent like regulate their own journalists, but we feel like that problem is exasperated to an uncontrollable degree when it comes to state media. Because when it comes to the state, they want to propagate one narrative, and we think that is their own narrative. We think that when it comes to that narrative, we think journalists that work under the state are unlikely to, for example, explore other kinds of topics, and they might not get those same job opportunities within the private sector because it's the state-run media that's dominant over there. We think that's when their own pursuit of happiness and the pursuit of fulfilling and self-actualizing their identity and exploring the issues that they really care about and writing articles free of censorship is curtailed. We think that when the state censors their own journalists, that's an incredibly drastic harm that we don't think that opposition will really cater to within this debate. We think journalists, as a separate stakeholder we've shown, are undermined within their work. What have we shown to you in this debate, or what have we done for you as a proposition? We've not been extreme in any of our characterizations. We've shown to you in the best case where there are counter-narratives. Those counter-narratives are barely functional because of the fact that the state actively gives preference to its own news source. But even in the end, then we move on to their worst case, which is in the instances where there is no counter-narrative. We don't think they're being reasonable. We don't think they're taking the burdens they ought to. We think they're simply being inconsistent. If you care about the vote, if you care about democracy, vote Pakistan.
So side proposition has been very unstrategic in today's debate. Insofar as they largely push the fact that since the government has an ability to be biased, we should never give it the ability to control anything, including media, right? Right, but running this logic, running this stance means that the government should not have court systems, the government should not have the curriculum, the government should not control anything because we can't trust them. What we tell you is, on the comparative, the actor that we can trust most within a true democratic society is in fact the government, insofar as we even trust them to make our own curriculums, right? Well, and insofar they even can see themselves that they want the government to create a curriculum, they can see that the government can be held accountable, they can see the government can be trusted, which is why it's not so big of a deal. The government can also have its own, can also own its own media. And that's why we're very proud to stand on our position. So, I'm going to do two things in today's debate. Firstly, I'm going to rebut and rebuild everything we've heard in today's speech so far, and then lastly, I'm going to present our last constructive argument about a diversity of views. Okay. So in that first argument, in that first speech, they come out to us with this narrative that like we're only going to see like state media who just wants to push their own agenda within incredibly corrupt governments, in which the party is in power, controls everything. They control the entire narrative, and they're even able to make you prosecute minorities in different ways, right? We tell you that this is largely unstrategic because we don't think that these are very much like true democracies. In a system in which, in a system in which the government in power controls everything and even controls how, for example, media, courts, or the prosecution system is being mandated, at this point, that's an incredibly corrupt regime and not inherently a true democracy, right? So they're focusing on the entirely wrong actions in today's debate. We think what we have to focus on is a government in which that is an actual true democracy, in which we have actual checks and balances. But we're also going to engage on this, slightly slippery slope. Why that's still there? No, thank you. Okay, let me tell you this point about how we won't have fair elections because all the politicians in power are just incentivized to be re-elected, and that's why they'll run the narrative that's why they'll control the media, right? We tell you that it's largely a good thing that politicians want to be re-elected, right? Because that means that the politicians in parliament who aren't in power have an incentive to make sure to criticize the state-owned media and to make sure that it is as neutral as possible, right? To make sure that they still have the chance to be elected, right? And we also tell you that we are able to have accountability in this measure. We are able to make so, that it isn't just the government who's currently running the country that controls everything they say, right? We currently have a division of power within democratic countries, right? For example, the court system is separated from the government, but it's still a government created an own institution, right? We tell you that this would largely be the same thing with the media and would be able to be held accountable by the state and the rules that have been set down for media, right? We tell you that with the rules set down for media, it's expected to be neutral and it's going to be regulated to be neutral because every single citizen is paying for the state-owned media for it to be neutral. So in this way, they have to cater to every single citizen. So if it does not, the citizen is going to complain. And the parliament is going to complain, making sure that it changes and stays neutral. But on the other hand, let's look at the comparative from that side, right? If we only have private-owned media, they have no obligation and they have no code of conduct to make sure that they stay neutral, right? We even tell you that a lot of private-owned media, even though they contest this, that's a very unstrategic thing, right? A lot of private media are very open about that bias, right? We tell you about, for example, the Daily Wire, who are very open about the fact that they're conservative and they want to push this narrative. Or, for example, the Young Turks, who are very open about the fact that they're very closely tied to social justice, right? For a lot of cases with these privately owned media, they're very open about their biases, right? But that doesn't mean that we want to abolish them, right? We still want them to exist, we still want them to be a counter-narrative and a check on the state, right? So in this way that if a state goes towards moving away from democracy, they can start to criticize the state and we can still have this media, right? We still support free press, we don't want to abolish that. Okay. Yes, and now let's move into the second point about how this media will just portray their own social norms and try to prosecute ethnic groups, right? We tell you largely, if the government is able to push a narrative, if the government controls the majority narrative within society, as for example in Pakistan, that a certain group of the population, Iraq, that a certain part of the population should be prosecuted, right? If they're able to do this, and if they're able to prosecute them with their own state, right, that's not a democratic system. That's a system in which the government is able to push their own narrative, right? And even if they didn't have their own media, if the country is so incredibly corrupt, that they control the narrative, they will probably just bribe the existing private media to push their own narrative, right? We think that because of this, these sort of countries largely follow the debate, because on either side, they can push their own narrative and manipulate their population if that's what they have the power to and they have the incentive to do, right? So they fall out of the debate. They have to focus on true democracies, as we have on our side, right? Okay, then let's say this thing about how the state will always be biased and they'll always bring opinions. Yeah, sure. We tell you that there are also news pieces well, there'll need to be an opinion on it, right? But we tell them that, well, this looks like with state-owned media, since they have an obligation to be neutral, since they're regulated to be neutral, they would probably bring in panelists to talk about these stories. They would bring in people with different opinions to talk about their opinion on certain cases, right? But on the contrary, with private news, you would hear it directly from the horse's mouth, right? The anchor who you trust will tell you, this is the correct thing, this is the right thing. They won't bring in a panel, they'll just tell you directly, no thank you, we are a biased news source, and this is what we think about it, right? They won't bring in a panel to talk about it. And even if they do, they're likely to bring in strawmen. As for example, in Fox News, where brought in a transgender woman to talk about transgender right, and transgender woman said that she regretted the operation and thought that no one should go through it, right? We think that they have a bias and they're open for it, and they're going to push it. On the contrary, state-owned news are mandated to be neutral, and there'll always be this sort of neutral source to come to. And they tell you that, no thank you, sometimes they'll be first, and sometimes they'll be what people rely on for news. Well, that's a freaking good thing, right? But we have established news that's neutral and ensured to be neutral and brings objective facts, and even if they have opinions, and no thank you, it's a pretty good thing that people go to this as a first impression for news, because then they know the whole story. They're not being given a bias, they're being given an actual true story they can rely on, which brings me perfectly into my third point about diversity of views. But before I continue, sure.
How do individuals who get information from the governing party vote out the governing party?
Because we still have free press, right? If the governing party is going towards being undemocratic and going towards controlling every part of the government and pushing their own narrative, we still have a free and private press who can critique that. And even so, right? Even so, we don't see why the state-owned news source wouldn't criticize the current government, right? It's not their duty to always protect and support the current government. They can also criticize the politicians who are currently in power, which will make sure that people can have accountability, right? We think that actually not ignore this. Okay, so let's move into the point about diversity of views. So we believe that the state has an incentive to show news that caters to all sorts of different groups. Like Wright says, this is because the state-owned news are funded through people's taxes. So they have an obligation, and they are held responsible to holding news which can supply to everyone. This means that they're likely to bring stories that cater to minorities. They're likely to have programs that cater to both the elderly and the youth, right? Huge democratization of populations. And that will be within one news source that everyone can go to and see, right? And why is this largely a good thing? This means that instead of having to go to your own echo chamber bubble in order to see something that represents you, the state-owned news source will always be able to cater towards you. So you'll always be able to look for it through credible information. This creates a sort of ground zero for information within society, right? Because people can always look towards this. People can always look towards something that's fairly neutral and sort of caters to everyone. This means that we come out of this sort of post-fact society in which people understand the fact saying facts don't really matter because all sorts of news media always want to push their own agenda, right? But we have something that's truly neutral, that brings the whole story, that brings the facts. People will always be able to hold all other news sources accountable by having the true neutralizer, which is the state-owned media. So because we want to democratize news, not politicize news, we're very proud to stand outside opposition.
The government that they're trusting to be your primary source of information, ladies and gentlemen, is the same government that wanted to imprison Julian Assange when he talked against the government, when he revealed the injustices that the government was carrying out. It's also the same government that Edward Snowden had to flee from because he revealed that it was spying on you unfairly. It is the same government, ladies and gentlemen, that imprisoned Chelsea Manning because of the information and injustice he revealed about the Iraq War. This is the government they are trusting to be your primary source of information. Is that something that you are okay with? Their government is the government in which Trump, who shouts fake news at every single thing, now has complete control of the narrative, ladies and gentlemen. Is that a government you trust? Is that a source of information you trust? We don't think so, ladies and gentlemen. But before we move on to the issues, a couple of things. First of all, they keep saying that private media organizations are really, really bad. They're politicized, not democratized, ladies and gentlemen. Yet, for some reason, they exist in their model. And not only do they exist in their model, they are trusting these same bad private organizations to be your primary source of counter-narrative against the government. How is that possible? But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, when they say that you need these private organizations to exist as a counter-narrative, they concede that the government is not trustable, it is not a trustworthy source of information because you clearly need a counter-narrative in place, ladies and gentlemen. That's inconsistent with everything that they've been saying. But thirdly, their case literally rests on the assumption that state-owned media will be neutral. So if we break down this assumption, their case is gone, and we have won this debate. But before we move on to
after doing just that, a couple of more things, right? First of all, they have not ever once in this debate engaged with our best case scenario, places like Singapore, where largely your media sources are just state-run and private counter-narrative, something that we're both for and against, does not exist, ladies and gentlemen. But we think that's a huge harm. Secondly, we think that they haven't refuted the idea that, and in fact have, by not engaging with it, conceded to it, that your government, even where a society where counter-narratives exist, is your primary and first source of information, which means that that narrative that they push is the one that is most widely bought because it's the first thing you hear and intuitively agree with, ladies and gentlemen. But thirdly, they have not once engaged with Sarab's line of argument about journalistic integrity, ladies and gentlemen, and how important that is and how the state takes away from that. We think that is a huge independent harm on its own that we can win this debate on, and third, opposition is way too late to deal with all of this, right? So having shown you that we've clearly already taken this debate, let's move on to the three issues in the debate. First of all, on a principle level, does the state have the right to be able to manipulate your vote regardless of whether they are successful in doing so? We think absolutely not. Secondly, where is the media more independent? Is it in a world where literally the governing party gets to tell you what you want to know and what you should be thinking of and what your values should be? Thirdly, where is there greater access of information? And over here I'll be dealing with their idea about how the state has greater incentive to spread out information and facilitate the right information. But let's move on to the first principle issue, right? And you need to understand in the context of this debate, this is an extremely important issue because a democracy is only a democracy if it lives up to its principles, ladies and gentlemen. If it contradicts those, it's not a democracy, right? So let's talk to you about how they're doing exactly that. They have a bunch of premises over here. They said, first of all, the state has to facilitate your right to information, and it's kind of like a public service. And over here, the analogy they made was a bus, ladies and gentlemen. We think a bus or any transport system or healthcare system is not the same thing. We think you can use a bus to influence your vote. You can use a bus to tell you that this same party that has been in power for 60 years should continue being in power for the next 60 years, ladies and gentlemen. Believe me, the Pakistani government has tried. But secondly, even if the state has to facilitate this right information, right? We think that they never once proved to us that this provision must be direct. They never once gave us that essential link. We don't think this provision has to be direct, especially when indirect provision through private corporations, it facilitates this right much, much better, ladies and gentlemen. But the second idea they had over here, this analogy with the government curriculum, and somehow for some absurd reason, they think that the state controlling your history books is a good thing. You know what the Pakistani state-mandated history book tells us? It tells us that the genocide we carried out against Bangladesh does not exist, ladies and gentlemen. It underplays its own heart. It underplays all the injustices carried out, not just against other people, but against its own citizens, its Ahmadi population, its Shia population, its Christian population, ladies and gentlemen, all of these things. So we don't understand why this is a good thing in any scenario. But the third thing they talked about over here was the separation of powers. I will take you as soon as I finish with this issue. And they never once explained to us how this separation of powers better happen in their world. This principal premise of theirs is entirely contingent on whether or not the separation of powers is actually effective, so I'll deal with that in the second issue, but before that, sure.
If a country is so corrupt that one political party is able to run the entire narrative of that country, can they just drive news media on yours at the house?
The point is, where will the government not be corrupt? In a world where the government controls your information, or in a world where someone else is keeping an independent check on that information, which is what I'm going to talk about in this issue, right? Over here they said, oh look, the BBC is neutral. An example, by the way, that their own second speaker dropped later on. But let's take them at their best and say that BBC is this great shining example that they're running with, right? That's completely untrue. When Brexit was happening, because David Cameron was anti-Brexit, the BBC literally released a slew of news that was severely anti-Brexit, ladies and gentlemen. It's not true. But secondly, over here with this example, they're not taking our context into account, because the developing world where you have weak democracies that need to be made more accountable is a huge, huge part of this debate that they're not taking down. The second thing they talked about is, oh, politicians have an incentive to criticize the media. First of all, let's look at who these politicians are. If they're part of the governing party, ladies and gentlemen, then they have absolutely no incentive to criticize the media that is putting them in a good light, right? But secondly, if these politicians are not
in the ruling party, we think that their voices are literally going to be drowned out by state narratives, because as you have conceded, state narratives are clearly much stronger, which is why you said that you need a counter narrative against them, right? So criticism from anyone else literally does not count, because you conceded that this is the first source of information. But thirdly, they said that, oh, you know what, private media also has biases. The difference is the intention, ladies and gentlemen. Private media does not have an ideological stance because it wants to indoctrinate you. It has an ideological stance because it's trying to cater to a certain consumer base that already exists. Governments tell you things because they are trying to create a consumer base that is in their favor, ladies and gentlemen. They think that is manufacturing consent. It's not okay. But they lastly said, oh, where the state will still bribe you in our world. We think, okay, where is it easier though? In this world where the state doesn't have to do something illegal to pass on propaganda, or where they have to do something illegal to pass on propaganda and thus can be held accountable for it. Clearly this world. Last issue of access, where they didn't have a lot of analysis, they should have just said that private corporations have profit incentives, so private prices will be high. We think it's the opposite. Because they have a profit incentive, they need to make sure that it's accessible to the most amount of people, which means prices will be definitely lower in our world, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, even if there's greater access in their world, that access is useless because it's literally propaganda. We don't want access like that. That's the point. Vote for a free world. Vote for Pakistan.
Team Proposition lives in a dystopic world in which democracies apparently oppress every single minority, never leave power ever, imprison all of their opponents, and censor the media. Ladies and gentlemen, the cases that they're talking about are actually completely irrelevant to this debate, given that they're not democracies, given that these are states that could probably just bribe the media or threaten to close them if they didn't adhere to their kind of narrative, right? We think that the bulk of the case that they bring to you is not relevant to this debate insofar as the harms that they tell you about largely do not apply. Panel. Information is a cornerstone on democracy, and both sides agree with that. Unfortunately, Team Proposition fails to engage with the comparative of whether it's better to have state and private, or only private, that only have their own market incentives to cater to, that do not have the interest of the public in mind. We're proud to oppose this motion. Before I get into my two themes about democracy and the quality of news, firstly, I'll just deal with our burden. Because they tell us, oh, it's so contradictory that you support also to have private news. No, we don't think it is. We think it's perfectly legitimate for us to say that we want both, right? Why is that? That's because these two types of media have different kind of values and functions in society, right? We think that the government media, in the majority of cases, will be the most neutral, oftentimes be the better one, but we recognize that states can make mistakes. We recognize that news are never perfectly objective. Hence, it's good to have several perspectives on this. We just think that the state should be one of multiple providers. That's not a contradiction for us to say we support free media and state media at once. Okay, first theme about democracy. So, the entirety of Team Pakistan's case is hinged on these ideas that states always try to push their own narrative, always try to stay in government, are super corrupt and horrible, and have no free media, right? Okay, first of all, this narrative does not apply to this debate. If you are such a horrible state, you could probably just bribe or threaten the media. We don't think free media, the private media on their side is much better, right? Okay, but let's not actually deal with what this debate is really about. Okay, let's deal with actually democratic countries, right? We don't see that this is largely a problem in the status quo where the news media is super biased based on the government. We don't see that BBC changes its partisan approach every 4 years, whether based on whether Labour or Conservative are in power, right? No, they criticize the government for what they do. We have journalists who are committed towards actually criticizing the state and looking at what actually happens. We don't think they point to a problem that really exists in the status quo whatsoever, right? Okay, but let's then take them on their best and say that this principle is just really, really important, that the mere fact that they have the ability to do so is so horrible. Okay, first of all, we think this is very illogical at the point where we can never entrust the state with anything whatsoever if that's the case, right? Do they just want the government to never say any information to the public? Do they just want the government to never make schools, never provide public services because they'll always just use it as an avenue to indoctrinate its citizens? No, Mary has told you how there's already a division of government. For example, the government is funding the police, funding the judicial system. In these instances, we already trust that these entities are separate enough that the state can fund them and have influence over them without that meaning that there cannot be a mutual interdependency, a mutual accountability here, right? But then secondly, we think the government essentially represents the population. The government is an extension of the population. That means that if citizens are not satisfied with this news media, they can vote out the government. that's a problem. Oh, but then they say, oh, the state always has a monopoly. People will only trust this news source. Not true. Like, people are interested in different types of news. If people have a different opinion than the government media, they will go to another media, and that's fine, right? But secondly, like, we don't think it's so bad if people look to this media if we can prove that in the majority of cases it will be the best one. Then finally, we have this point about tyranny of the majority and minorities will be really, really demonized. We think that's even more so the case with private news media because they don't have an incentive to appeal to minority groups, right? They have an incentive to appeal to the majority as they themselves concede. No, thank you. Let's deal with our principle. We told you how, in fact, it's extremely, extremely important that the government provides information to its citizens and provides access to these informations. We think that it's extremely expensive to create really, really good news. That's why news sources such as The Economist is not free, right? That's because it's like good journalism is very expensive. We think only with taxpayer money can we ensure that we don't just raise prices, but simultaneously provide good journalism. We want quality and accessibility to everyone, and we don't think that private organizations can ever provide that. We can only, even if private organizations could, we can only be ensured that this can happen once the government actually says, we take this burden upon us, we will provide you with information. We think that's the duty of the government. Final thing about journalistic integrity, very relevant point. No journalists are still independent even though they work for the government. Like, if they don't think they are, they can just choose to work somewhere else. Really not relevant. But finally, private organizations also have bipartisan agreements. If you work for Fox News, you can't just have a super liberal agenda, then you also be fired. Point not relevant. Okay, so at the end of this theme, we think it's crucial to recognize that state media is actually crucial to fulfill the purpose of democracy, not contradictory to the purpose of democracy. It's the only way we can ensure information that allows people to make proper decisions. Secondly, let's talk about equality of news, quite related, right? We think largely all of our practical implications have gone unresponded to from Team Pakistan. Yes, we recognize that like public news sources are not perfect. They will sometimes make mistakes. They will not always be completely unbiased, but at least we gave you structural reasons why they're better on our side of the house. Why is that? Firstly, we told you several accountability mechanisms that they just ignored, right? We told you about how, like, even though it is a government institution, it is an independent branch, and journalists abide by some kind of code of conduct. Journalists usually are extremely committed to their job and to exposing the state. If they don't do that, they'll probably be fired, right? No, thank you. But secondly, there's also other parties of government that can say, hey, like, we feel really unfairly treated. We don't think this is right. Just like we see debates within parliament about policies. We see citizens can complain. We think that if these news media are so horrible, like state funding will probably be withdrawn from them because no one supports them. Hence, they have an incentive to maintain support from the public and from the entire parliament. Makes no sense. Okay, then we also told you about how private, like public organizations have stable funding. That's really important, right? Because on their side, you always have to make sure that you survive based on market mechanisms. You always have to make sure that you have customers. That's important because that means you're more likely to appeal to entertainment, to sensationalism, because that's the way you attract viewers, right? State media has no incentive to do so at the point where they always have tax money. They can always prioritize the most important stories, even if it's expensive to cover them. They cannot do that on their side of the house because you always have to balance budgets and make sure. But then they say, oh, the private has an incentive to be centric. Well, first of all, not always. We don't think Fox News is particularly centric, right? Like, they often have an incentive to appeal to a specific group in society. But even if they are, that doesn't deal with the point of how they have an incentive to be, like, entertaining. So even if they have, like, a panel debate, for example, they're probably more likely to choose the really, like, extreme pro-life advocate instead of the moderate one, because that provides more viewers. That provides a really intense debate, right? We think it's a problem on their side. The private news media are going to be sensationalists, are going to prioritize the wrong stories because there's no public accountability as to how they do this, right? At the end of the day, dear panel, we have to ensure that everyone has access to proper information in a democracy. We want democratized news, not politicized news. Proud to oppose.
Dear panel, neutral news is nearly impossible to reach. Actors and societies will always have their own incentives. That is why we need the coexistence of both state-run and private media. Instead of talking about the dystopian states that would indoctrinate their citizens, Team Proposition needed to defend their world. A world in which you only have privately run companies and the incentives that they have. We gave you the coexistence. We're very proud to have taken today's debate. First off, what do we think Team Proposition needed to do? They needed to not base their case in this world of oppressive states, but talk to us about why private companies could bear this burden. We have the democratized news and not the politicized. We think in this debate, both sides sides wanted to achieve an informative, diverse, neutral, and accurate set of news, what were the reasons why we actually would decide to provide you with that? Now, we think first off, we told you two different things. Team Pakistan decided to focus on really one of them. So first off, we tell you that states are held accountable because of the framework that they insist of. Every single thing that a state touches is something that they have to be accountable for because they either lose a vote, right? That is why parties speak out on what other parties do. You have ombudsmen that criticize what the state does. These on a comparative were things that just didn't exist in the world, right? So even if you buy that to some extent, states are a bit indoctrinating, right? We didn't think that there was any reason why that didn't happen on their side. Why was that? That was because private companies always have the incentive of reaching profits for different reasons, right? First off, sometimes they were simply just controlled by corporations, forcing them to put NRA advertisements in every other minute, right? But also, they were funded to the extent that they would prioritize sensationalism. They would prioritize not having fair panels that discuss topics in a fair way. Secondly, we talked to you about how we provide you access to actually voting, right? We think that was important because states need to make sure that every single citizen is in a position of being able to vote in a sense that actually affects them in the end. On their side, media costs money, right? You have to have the efficient money to buy that. You have the efficient money to be informed. In a democracy, the state actually neglects this group, as to which they don't have the money to be informed, right? We think that what were the responses that Team Pakistan gave here? First off, they told you, on a purely deontological basis, if the state has an ability to coerce you, the ability to misportray some information, the state just shouldn't be able to do that, right? We think that was really not specific to the motion to the extent that now the state shouldn't be able to give you any information. They shouldn't be able to really inform you of anything, right? Because it might be coercive in that sense. But also, they tell you, why do you want this coercive media if you think it's so wrong? That was not an answer to the extent we think they actually conceded to these media being the private media being wrong, but also we supported the coexistence. In their world, other media can call out these media, right? We think we have that on our side. In the worst case scenario, right, which were the terrible governments that would go out, coerce their citizens to support things, shut down journalists, this was a world that just wasn't relevant within today's debate, right? Because these were the governments who would also coerce private news organizations, who would also go out and change the whole political picture. We think that insofar as we provided you with the access, the best information for everyone within society, it was good we took today's debate. In the end, a world of private media is a world for only those who have the money to afford to get information, those who are lucky enough to be informed, to know what they go out and vote for, right? Which are not the poor, not the minorities, but also it was the ones who would not fall prey to the coercive media we think that private entities are. Because we have democratized news, not the politicized. We're very proud to take this.
Opposition constantly accuses us of arguing in a dystopian world where we're not arguing actual democracies. The United States of America, the shining example of the best democracy within the world, is what we also contextualize this as when we give you examples of how they turn against their people, they actively monitor their people, infringe their right to privacy. We talked to you about the United Kingdom, where the BBC ran a lot of anti-Brexit news in the recent election campaign and was constantly accused of that. We gave you the example of Singapore, one of the large, a country where democracy, it does, but apart from that, that's not what this debate was about. Because we feel like what they're trying to argue that these democracies are weak, so they aren't a part of this debate. What we were trying to argue was that they're weak because of state-run media. And it's about in which world they're going to be less corrupt, less weak. That's the actual comparative. That's what we've been constantly running throughout this debate, something they don't understand. So just because they don't understand the real world, that doesn't mean that our case doesn't stand. But apart from that, when it comes to burdens, understand that they accept the burden we took on. They didn't challenge it when we told you it's just our burden to prove on a principle level why the state shouldn't have the ability to go for this measure, and that's the first issue. They conceded to this. So if we win this debate, so let's do that. Our claim was that the government shouldn't be able to indoctrinate people in order to maintain its own power. They keep talking about things like police and the bus, but that's not indoctrination, that's just policy. If I'm giving a healthcare scheme, I'm not telling someone that you have to, I'm not indoctrinating that individual to cast a certain kind of vote or limiting his information. We think that's something they didn't understand. But even in the cases of other kinds of indoctrination that government does, like education, they completely ignored our response about how the government is very biased in doing that, and that's something that we strongly oppose, how the Pakistani government does indoctrinate people into forgetting about genocides. That's something we're not okay with. There was no response to this whatsoever. And apart from that, we also talked to you about this idea regarding how politicians shouldn't be allowed to fund their campaigns with taxpayer money. That was never once engaged with. They said, well, that's different, that already happens. We think that's a principal analogy still stands within this debate. But apart from that, they're like, well, the government has a duty to provide a free good. Here where we talk to you about how the prices are generally lower even when it comes to articles like The Economist, but they're arguing a very small minority. The majority of news like Fox News and CNN are all free, right? Even though they are owned by private corporations through things like advertisement deals, something they themselves talked about. So on a principle level, we think you shouldn't put this tool in the hands of the government. It's not their job. But secondly, when it comes to better political and social outcomes, over here they said, well, people can always hold the government accountable, and bias doesn't exist because of accountability mechanisms like politicians and citizens saying that, well, this is biased or that this is our narrative. Here's where we told you, politicians' voices are drowned out within this overwhelming narrative, but on a second level, that citizens don't get the conscience to say that, well, this is wrong, because they themselves have been trapped and indoctrinated by this. That's where they concede that it is the primary source of information, which is why people are more likely to believe it because it gets their spin on it. That's where they concede to the very fact that people don't have the capacity to vote out a government for being bad or for there even being a problem when they don't know a problem exists. That's something they don't really refute, and we've given you examples of Singapore about how that's produced bad political outcomes, and where there's like, well, journalists have a code of conduct. We already refuted that within my positive case, but how these journalists are actively pushed out and told not to follow that, so we don't see what they're on about. But when it comes to social outcomes, we think that they don't really deal with that either, because their only refutation to things like Myanmar was it's not a part of this debate. I've already shown you at the start that it was. And lastly, because the fact that they're being principally inconsistent and not fulfilling their own burden to only have, for example, private companies, because if the state to not have private companies at all, then if the state is so great, they should only allow that narrative. We feel that this debate deserves to go to Pakistan.